Airports are supposed to be the great equalizer, everyone shuffling through the same security lines, waiting for the same boarding calls. But every so often, a single moment slices through the routine and reminds us that some stories deserve more than anonymity. This one began with a clerical error, or maybe a quiet disregard that pushed a decorated war hero from a paid business class seat to the cramped back row of a commercial flight. To the gate agent, he was just another passenger. To the people around him, he was nobody special. But to one man, a four-star general, passing through the same terminal, his name carried the weight of sacrifice, courage, and missions that never made the evening news. What happened next wasn't about luxury seating or airline policy. It was about recognition long overdue, a deliberate act to pull a forgotten hero out of obscurity and place him, quite literally, where he belonged. Through present-day encounters and raw flashbacks of battle, this is the story of a soldier who never asked for acknowledgement, and a commander who refused to let him go unseen. It's a reminder that gratitude is not a perk, it's a debt, and sometimes it's paid in public view. The boarding line shuffled forward with the slow rhythm of travel fatigue, rolling bags squeaking, boarding passes fluttering, the murmur of half-listening conversations. To anyone watching, the tall, broad-shouldered man in the worn leather jacket looked like any other midweek business traveler. He was calm, reserved. His gaze didn't wander to the duty-free shops or the glossy billboards. Instead, it held steady, as if he were measuring each second against an invisible clock only he could see. On his ticket, the letters business class were printed clearly, a small indulgence he rarely allowed himself, paid for with a modest savings from his new civilian job. But when he scanned his pass at the gate, the agent frowned, the kind of practiced frown born of long shifts and endless queues, and tapped a few keys. "You've been reassigned," she said, her tone as casual as if she were telling him the weather. "Seat 3 for B, rear cabin." He blinked, but only once. "I booked for A," he replied softly. "Full flight. We had to adjust seating. Sorry." The word sorry landed like an afterthought. He nodded once and stepped aside. No scene, no protest. The people behind him shuffled impatiently. If they noticed the exchange at all, they probably assumed he'd made some booking error. To them, he was just another passenger heading to the back of the plane. What they didn't see, what nobody in that terminal seemed to see, was that this man had once led a rescue mission under heavy enemy fire, pulling 3 wounded soldiers to safety when retreat was the only sane option. They didn't see the ribbon of the Silver Star tucked away in a box at home, or the citation that read conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. They didn't know his name was etched into the kind of military after-action reports that get read aloud in hushed, reverent tones in certain circles. To them, he was just another boarding pass and a piece of luggage. At gate 22, a very different figure was making his way through the terminal, for silver stars glinted from the epaulets of his uniform, the kind of rank that turned heads, though not always for the right reasons. General Marcus Halstead had been traveling on official business en route to a strategy summit. His stride was brisk, his eyes alert, scanning faces and surroundings with the reflexive habit of someone who'd spent decades reading people foretells. That was when he saw the name on the manifest. It had been printed on the passenger list he glimpsed earlier while chatting with the gate supervisor. Most names had meant nothing to him, but one stood out: Colonel Daniel Reeves. Halstead had never forgotten that name. He remembered the battlefield reports, the satellite photos, the near impossible extraction under hostile fire. He remembered a recommendation for the Medal of Honor that had somehow stalled in bureaucratic limbo, and he remembered thinking, even then, that Reeves was the kind of soldier whose quiet professionalism could make generals look loud and clumsy by comparison. Halstead's eyes swept the boarding crowd until they locked on Reeves, now halfway down the jet bridge, and then he saw it, the seat assignment printed on the small stub in Reeves's hand. 3 for B. Something inside Halstead stiffened. It wasn't just about a seat, it was about what it symbolized. This man had spent decades putting his life on the line for people who'd never know his name, and here he was, being shuffled to the last row like an afterthought. The general didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, strode back to the gate podium, and produced his military ID. His voice, calm but edged with authority, carried the weight of someone used to immediate compliance. "This plane isn't leaving yet," he told the agent. The gate staff rose, their practice script faltering. Sir, we're about to. Not until Colonel Reeves is seated in the front where he belongs, Halstead said. Or better yet, I'll have a transport arranged for him. Either way, this aircraft is not departing while he sits in the back. Some passengers nearby glanced up, curious, but most kept scrolling through their phones. The scene wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but the stillness in Halstead's tone cut through the background. Noise like a rifle crack in a quiet field. Behind that moment, in Reeves's own mind, memories stirred, not of medals or ceremonies, but of the dust-choked heat of Kandahar, the stench of burnt rubber and curdite, the desperate radio calls over a broken channel. He remembered kneeling in the dirt, tourniquet in one hand, sidearm in the other, as rounds tore into the wall behind him. He remembered a comrade's voice, fading fast, whispering, "Go without me," and the choice to ignore it. The boarding line had stopped moving entirely now. Halstead stepped aside, scanning for Reeves, who had paused midway down the jet bridge, his expression a blend of confusion and reluctant recognition. It had been years since they'd met in person, but some bonds in the military didn't fade. With time, Reeves knew the kind of rank it took to halt a commercial flight, and he knew, instinctively, that this was not about protocol. It was about respect. The general gave a small nod, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. The fine rain tapped against the terminal windows, drawing thin, uneven rivers that trickled toward the sill. Each drop caught the faint glow of the runway lights, bending it into tiny fragments before sliding away. Inside the aircraft, the air was heavy, as if the recycled oxygen had been breathed one too many times. The faint hum of the ventilation system was mixed with the scent of burnt coffee and oversprayed cologne. Daniel Reeves sat in the narrow aisle seat of row 34, knees angled slightly to avoid brushing the seat in front of him. The weight of his backpack pressed between his shoes. He hadn't even fastened his seatbelt yet. He didn't need to. He could already tell this was going to be a long flight. He hadn't planned to sit here. His ticket had been for business class, for a window seat with enough legroom to stretch and maybe catch some sleep. But a casual remark from the gate agent had stripped that away. A reassignment. No explanation beyond full flight, and we had to adjust seating. There had been no apology worth keeping. He had accepted it without protest, because arguing wasn't in him anymore. As the last few passengers struggled to find space for their bags overhead, Reeves let his mind drift, and the walls of the plane began to dissolve. His body was in seat 3 for B, but his thoughts were back in Kandahar, in a place where airliners didn't land and where the horizon shimmered with heat and danger. It had been his second summer there, in a valley where the dust never settled. The heat that day had been so intense it blurred the air, turning the distant hills into wavering mirages. The wind carried sand fine enough to scrape the skin, each grain a needle against exposed flesh. Reeves had been leading a 6-man detachment on a reconnaissance patrol. That was supposed to be simple, in and out, eyes open, no contact, but the enemy had been waiting. The ambush came with a sound he could still feel in his bones, the flat crack of rifles and the sharp, metallic cough of machine guns. Bullets chewed into the dirt at his feet and snapped against rock. Then came the explosions, mortars pounding the slope behind them, each blast lifting him from the ground. 3 men went down in the first 30 seconds. One was screaming, clutching his thigh, blood pouring through his fingers. Another was crawling, dragging himself toward cover. The third lay still. Reeves grabbed his radio, heard the words pull back and leave them, and knew before the sentence finished that he wasn't obeying. He dropped the transmitter, cinched his helmet strap tighter, and ran into the open. The heat from the bullets felt like it skimmed his skin. His boots kicked up dust, turning the air into a choking cloud. He reached the first man, hooked an arm under his shoulder, and dragged him backward to a shallow depression that offered barely enough cover. Without a pause, he sprinted again, this time for the unconscious soldier. A burst of fire stitched the ground inches from his knees, and a shard of stone sliced across his cheek. Still, he kept moving. The last man was the heaviest. As Reeves hoisted him up, a shot slammed into his pack, tearing it open and showering them both with sand. He fell to one knee, shielding the man with his body until the firing shifted. Then, teeth clenched, he pushed up and staggered toward the ridgeline where friendly forces waited. By the time he crossed it, the muscles in his legs had given up, and he dropped, unable to take another step. The medal came later. The ceremony was short. He had stood at attention, received the Silver Star from a general whose name he couldn't remember, and then quietly walked away. For Reeves, it wasn't a badge of pride. It was a reminder of the faces that never came home. Back in seat 3 for B, Reeves rubbed his face and pulled himself from the memory. Beside him, a woman scrolled her phone with one hand and sipped ginger ale with the other. A toddler somewhere ahead whined about being hungry. People shifted in their seats, oblivious to the man sitting among them, just another passenger in economy. At gate 22, General Marcus Halstead had not moved on. He still stood at the podium, speaking in a voice that was calm yet immovable. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders caught the light each time he turned. A supervisor tried to explain boarding procedures and the importance of an on-time departure, but Halstead cut through the words like wire. Protocols don't outrank honor, he said. Eyes fixed on the agent. Not while I'm here. 2 minutes later, a flight attendant entered the cabin. She walked the aisle briskly, stopping at Reeves's row. Sir, General Halstead has requested you join him at the front of the aircraft. Reeves glanced up. That's not necessary. It is, sir, she replied, the firmness in her tone carrying a weight far heavier than customer service policy. He rose, shouldering his backpack. As he made his way forward, he noticed a few curious glances, but no one asked why. The narrow aisle forced him close to strangers who instinctively drew back their knees. At the doorway, Halstead waited, tall and still, the expression on his face both formal and personal. I couldn't let this pass, Colonel, Halstead said, voice low enough for only Reeves to hear. There are things you don't do to a man. Who's done what you've done? Reeves hesitated before answering. His mind was back in that desert night. The pounding artillery flashes, the cries for medics, the unbearable silence that followed. He thought of promises made over blood-stained sand. I just wanted to get where I'm going without being noticed, he said. You will, Halstead replied, with the respect you've earned. I've arranged a seat in the front, or, if you prefer, I'll have you flown by military transport. Reeves studied him. He didn't like special treatment. He'd seen too much to value ceremony. But Halstead's gaze told him this wasn't a favor. It was a statement, not just for him, but for every soldier whose name was known only to those who fought beside them. They walked together toward the first rows. As Reeves settled into the wide seat, he felt a strange lightness, as if a burden he didn't know he'd been carrying had eased. He looked out the window, where the rain had turned heavier, smearing the runway lights into streaks of gold and white dot in the glass. His reflection showed an older man, lines etched by time and choice, but behind the eyes, he could still see the young lieutenant who once believed that courage alone could change the course of a war. The intercom crackled with the announcement for takeoff, but in Reeves's mind, the real departure had already happened years ago, on a scorched piece of earth where survival itself was the first and only class worth having. The engines had barely reached a steady hum when Reeves leaned back, hands clasped loosely over his lap. The upgraded seat felt far wider, softer, insulated from the press of knees and elbows that had hemmed him in moments before. He could feel the subtle vibration of the fuselage, a constant reminder that they were moving toward something. For most passengers, it was just another trip, another 2 or 3 hours suspended between departure and arrival. For Reeves, the quiet was never empty. It was filled with fragments of places and voices that no one else on this plane had heard. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, and in the darkened glass beside him, his reflection seemed to waver. The lines on his face were deeper than he remembered. Seeing in the mirror at home, age had come not just with years, but with the weight of memory. He looked away from himself and let his gaze follow the rivulets of rain, streaking backward across the window, each droplet catching the glow of the wing lights before breaking apart. Somewhere in the forward galley, Halstead was speaking quietly with a lead flight attendant. Reeves could hear none of it, but he didn't need to. The general's intervention had been decisive, almost surgical. One moment Reeves had been anonymous in row 34, the next he was here, his presence acknowledged not as a favor, but as a statement. That kind of authority wasn't used lightly. As the aircraft lifted off, the shift pressed him gently into the seat. The runway lights fell away, replaced by the scattered constellations of the city below. In that moment, a different scene overlaid itself in his mind. Another departure, years earlier, not in an air-conditioned cabin, but in the belly of ACH-47. Helicopter climbed its way into the Afghan night. The rotors had hammered the air so hard it felt like the ground itself was shaking apart. Inside, the smell of fuel and sweat mingled with the copper tang of blood. The wounded lay on stretchers, for bags swaying with emotion. Reeves had sat on the floor, one boot braced against the bulkhead, hand pressed to a corporal's shoulder wound, counting the seconds between the man's shallow breaths. The pilot had pushed hard to get them to the forward operating base, but the flight felt endless. Every shadow in the moonlit valleys below seemed to hide muzzle flashes. Reeves remembered glancing at the loadmaster, who gave a single nod the kind that meant they were almost clear. When the skids finally touched down, the medics moved in with an urgency that seemed choreographed, and Reeves had stepped aside, feeling the sudden emptiness of having nothing left to do. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin speakers, pulling him back to the present. We're at cruising altitude. Weather ahead is clear. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. The casual cheer in the tone was a language Reeves had almost forgotten how to speak. A flight attendant approached with a tray of drinks. "Can I get you something, sir?" "Water's fine," Reeves said. She poured it into a short glass, setting it gently on his tray table as though the act required ceremony. He nodded in thanks. Halstead appeared moments later, sliding into the empty seat beside him. The general didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I didn't know you were on this flight until I saw the manifest. Figured you keep your head down." "That was the idea," Reeves said. Halstead studied him for a moment. "Do you know how many times I've used my rank to move a plane?" "Never. Until today." Reeves exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Halstead replied. "Not for you alone, but for what you represent. Too many of the men we've served with have been forgotten. I won't watch that happen when I have the means to change it, even for an hour." For a while, they sat in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't demand words. Outside, the clouds rolled by in great, moonlit shapes, their edges glowing. Against the night sky, the sound of the engines was steady, almost hypnotic. Reeves broke the quiet first. "I think about them every day, the ones we lost. It's not something you can leave behind." "I know," Halstead said. "That's why gestures like this matter. They remind us that what we did wasn't invisible." Reeves sipped his water, the coldness grounding him. "It's strange. Back then, you're surrounded by people who know exactly what you've been through. Out here, you're just another face in the crowd. I thought I wanted that. Most days. I still do." Halstead gave a faint smile. "Even so, there's a difference between anonymity by choice and being overlooked out of ignorance." The hum of the cabin wrapped around them again. Reeves found his gaze drifting to the aisle, where passengers dozed under thin blankets or stared at glowing screens. They were traveling in a bubble of comfort and security that seemed a world away from the sharp edges of combat. And yet, he thought, the line between the two wasn't as wide as most believed. It could be crossed in a moment by a news headline, by an unexpected phone call, by the sudden knowledge that danger had come calling. He glanced back out the window. Below, the land had disappeared under a blanket of cloud. The moonlight painted it in shades of silver and shadow, a landscape without borders. He remembered night patrols where the darkness seemed absolute, and yet every movement, every shift of the wind carried meaning. Those were nights when you measured time not in hours, but in how many times. Your heart sped up before dawn. Halstead eventually stood, resting a hand briefly on Reeves's shoulder. "Get some rest. You've earned it more times than I can count." When the general moved back to his seat, Reeves remained awake. Sleep didn't come easily in the best of times, and the hum of the engines was too steady to unlike the mechanical growl of the aircraft he'd known in the service. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, but the images returned anyway: the flash of tracers in the night, the smell of dust and diesel, the feel of another man's weight as he carried him to safety. A soft chime signaled the beginning of the meal service. Reeves declined, keeping only the glass of water. He thought about the men who had been with him in Kandahar, about where they might be now, about who had made it back to the side of the sky, and who hadn't. The rain outside had stopped, and in its absence, the view cleared. Stars scattered across the darkness like a promise you could almost believe. If you looked long enough, somewhere ahead, the city where they would land was sleeping under its own web of lights. Reeves knew that when the wheels touched down, he would gather his things, nod to Halstead, and walk into the terminal as if nothing had happened. People would pass him without a second glance, and that was fine. But for these few hours, in this small, sealed world above the clouds, someone had remembered, and that, he thought, was enough. The night thinned as the aircraft crossed into calmer air. and a soft gradient of cobalt edged the horizon. Reeves stirred, not from sleep, but from the kind of drift that pauses for rest when the body refuses surrender. He rolled his shoulders against the seat and glanced down the aisle. The cabin had taken on that suspended quiet of late flights, when whispers are rare and the drone of engines stretches time. A flight attendant moved with careful steps, covering drowsy passengers with blankets they wouldn't remember accepting. Somewhere behind the curtain, crockery clinked faintly, a civilized sound that felt almost alien to him. He thought of the moment Halstead had turned away earlier, the weight of the general's hand on his shoulder lighter than memory, but heavier than rank. For a long time, Reeves had believed gestures didn't matter. He had believed in outcomes, lives saved, missions completed, teams intact. But here, in the hush of the cabin, the gesture seemed to ripple outward, touching more than the few rows up front. It reminded him of the unseen line that runs beneath uniforms and years: fidelity, affirmation, the stubborn insistence that some things are still sacred. He closed his eyes and saw a different room, a concrete chamber lit by a single humming bulb. The air smelled of oil and dust. It was months after Kandahar, during a training rotation stateside, where he had stepped into a simulator to teach younger officers how to manage chaos. They had loaded the program with overlapping crises communications collapse, casualty management, shifting objectives, and asked him to walk the candidates through it. He remembered their faces, eager, tired, studiously blank. He paused before the start and said, "The first thing you do is breathe. The second thing is see your people." A captain in the back had frowned. Reeves had added, "If you forget either, you'll win a fight and lose a war. The men will know." The landing lights blinked, a quiet announcement that the descent had begun. Reeves adjusted his seat and glanced out the window. Clouds parted like torn cloth, and the geometry of the city emerged: a lattice of streets, the glitter of industrial yards, the patient curve of a river catching the morning. He thought of the people down there, waking to alarms, brewing coffee, tying shoes, unaware that at 30,000 feet, a man who had pulled others from the teeth of death was looking down at their roofs and not begrudging them their peace. The captain spoke again, closer now, voice softened by the intercom. "Folks, we'll be on the ground in about 20 minutes. Weather is clear, a brisk morning on arrival, and we expect a short taxi." A murmur of movement followed. Seatbacks clicked upright. Shades lifted, families nudged children awake. Reeves slid his backpack from under the seat and placed it by his feet. The zipper snagged on the frayed edge where a bullet had once found canvas in a different world. He smoothed it down with his thumb. Halstead reappeared at the aisle, steady, despite the tilt of descent, and leaned toward Reeves without sitting. "You have anyone meeting you?" the general asked. "No," Reeves said. "I'm headed to a small ceremony. Quiet thing. Name added to a memorial at the Reserve Center. Thought I'd just take a cab and keep it simple." Halstead considered. Then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but the drive won't be alone." Reeves started to protest, caught the look in Halstead's eyes, and let it go, understood. The wheels met the runway with a firm kiss, rubber giving a brief protest that spiraled into a long, rising whine. Brakes engaged, reverse thrust, roared, and then the aircraft rolled to a purposeful jog. The passengers whooped softly in relief, the odd, reflexive celebration of returning to ground. Reeves felt the same release, though he kept it inside, counting a quiet cadence as the plane slowed. For 3, 2, taxi. They turned off the runway and joined the procession of silver bodies moving toward the gates. As the aircraft settled at the jet bridge, the forward door opened to a rectangle of crisp morning air, and the scent of dew and jet fuel slipped in. The lead flight attendant gave the practice farewell, but her eyes flicked once to Reeves and softened. He dipped his head in acknowledgement. They deplaned first. It wasn't an order. It happened naturally, like the tide leaning into shore. Halstead stepped into the jet bridge with that quiet gravity of his, and Reeves followed, boots finding the ribbed metal underfoot, breath fogging faintly in the cooler air. When they emerged into the terminal, the usual choreography awaited gates, disgorging people into serpentine lines, screens flickering with codes and times, the distant chime of an announcement about unattended bags. And yet, at the end of their bridge, a stillness stood, to service members in dress uniforms, a sergeant and a lieutenant, flanking a small path cleared by airport staff. Behind them, an airline manager adjusted his tie, nervous and earnest. "Colonel Reeves," the lieutenant said, hand at the brim of his cap. On behalf of those who served and those who fell, welcome home. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Reeves felt the moment catch in his chest and pass. He returned the salute, crisp and economical. Thank you, Lieutenant. A small honor cordon had formed, nothing ostentatious. Just a few soldiers and airmen who had been alerted in the handful of minutes since the general's call. One held a folded flag presented without fanfare. Another carried a thin folder. As they moved forward, civilians slowed and parted, curiosity loosening into attention, then into something like respect. Some placed hands over hearts. Some simply stood straighter and made room. Halstead walked beside Reeves without speaking. They reached the end of the cleared path where a single podium had been rolled. From a conference room, awkward on its wheels, suddenly dignified by the moment, the airline manager cleared his throat and stepped back, wisely ceding the ground to those better suited. The sergeant opened the folder. Sir, she said to Reeves, there is a letter here that was left in our archives after your last deployment. It was addressed to your unit, never delivered because the sender didn't have enough information. We found it this morning when your name came across our desk. She handed it over. Reeves took the envelope. The paper was cheap and aged. The handwriting wavered, uncertain but deliberate. He glanced at Halstead, who gave the smallest nod. Reeves broke the seal and unfolded the page. The words were simple. A mother thanking a unit she had never met for bringing her son home once after a firefight. Alive enough to say goodbye months later when sickness took what the enemy hadn't. She didn't know who had carried him that day. She only knew that a man with strong arms and a steady voice had told her boy he would see the sunrise. At the bottom, a line. If you ever read this, please know that you gave us another season with him. We used every minute. Reeves folded the letter along its creases and slid it back into the envelope. The terminal noise receded until it felt like they stood in a room made of quiet. He had spent years resisting the pull of moments like this. Now, he let it wash over him and through him and then find its level. He looked at Halstead. Thank you, he said, not for the seat, not for the path cleared through the terminal, but for the insistence that this, too, mattered. Halstead inclined his head. Ride's waiting, he said, just outside. They walked together through the terminal, the small honor party following in behind like a modest tide. At the curb, a dark sedan waited with a discreet emblem on the door. Beyond it, airport life flowed unbroken. Taxis jockeying for position, buses sign open, luggage carts rattling like distant drums. The driver stepped out, held the door. Reeves paused before entering and turned slightly. The two service members saluted again. He returned it with the same spare precision dot as the sedan pulled into traffic. The morning light sharpened edges and drew color into the world. Reeves watched the airport recede, watched contrails stripe the blue, watched the jet bank incline like a silver promise. Halstead sat angled toward him, one hand relaxed on his knee, the other holding a cell phone silence for this stretch of time. You could have let me walk out with everyone else, Reeves said, not accusatory, just stating a path that had been available. I could have, Halstead replied, but then they wouldn't have seen. Sometimes that's the work letting people see. The city opened ahead, brick and glass, old stone facade stubborn against the new. They crossed the river on a low bridge, water braiding itself around, pilings with patient insistence. Reeves thought of his ceremony, the addition of a name to a memorial, the rhythm of a bugle in an empty courtyard, the brief words spoken and then absorbed by wind. He had not known whether he wanted anyone there. Now, he realized he hadn't wanted to ask. He hadn't wanted to risk the hollow echo of no one answering. They turned onto a quieter road lined with sycamores scarred by past winters. A sign announced the reserve center ahead. The sedan slowed, then stopped before an open gate. Inside, a small gathering formed half a dozen service members, a chaplain, a woman holding a single white rose. Reeves felt the letter in his pocket, like a compass point. Halstead stepped out first, then held the door without flourish. Reeves joined him on the pavement, the smell of cut grass rising in the cool air. They walked toward the memorial stone set against a wall of brick, a sheet of polished granite, names etched with stubborn grace. A technician waited with a stencil and sandblaster, poised to carve one more. There were no cameras, no headlines, just the sound of leaves, the low murmur of people who knew how to stand in silence. The chaplain spoke a short prayer that fit the space and the hour. The technician began. A controlled hiss, and letters appeared where there had been none. Reeves focused on the line of the name, on the steadiness of the hand guiding it, on the idea that memory, too, required craft. When it was done, the woman with the rose stepped forward, placed it beneath the new carving, and touched the stone with her fingertips. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She turned to Reeves and gave a small, grateful nod, the kind that says the world was not fixed, but it was held, if only for this moment. Reeves stood very still. He felt the weight of years shift within him to find a new balance. Beside him, Halstead inhaled once, slow and even, as if matching his breath to Reeves's without being obvious about it. They weren't men given to speeches, and none were asked of them. After a time, they walked back toward the car. The day had fully arrived now, shadows shorter, colors brighter. At the curb, the general extended his hand. Reeves took it. No more. Needed saying. The gesture carried as much as words ever could. On the ride away, Reeves watched the reserve center fade behind trees. He thought of the plane, the cleared path, the letter that had found him after all these years. He opened the envelope again, read the last line twice, and felt it settle where it belonged. Outside, the city moved through its routines, unaware that something invisible had been corrected. He leaned back, eyes open, and let the quiet ride with him. The day stretched as the sedan threaded through the waking city. Reeves rode in quiet, palm on the letter. The driver kept an even pace, catching green lights. Beside him, Halstead watched. The sidewalks, the joggers, dog walkers, vendors raising shutters and registered each detail. Without distraction, dotted a corner diner. The general tapped the glass. "Here," he said. Inside, a bell over the door rang. The room held the first bloom of coffee. A woman at the counter looked up, recognized the uniforms without recognizing the men, and lifted a hand in greeting. They chose a booth near the window. Reeves set the letter on the table. The waitress arrived, pad ready, 2 coffees. Halstead said, then, and whatever comes hot off the griddle. The ordinary rhythm settled around them, plates sliding, silverware chimming, the hiss of batter meeting iron. "You going back after the ceremony?" Halstead asked. "Office tomorrow," Reeves said. "I teach contractors to plan for bad days. The slides always seem smaller than the days themselves. That's because slides don't bleed," Halstead said. "But they can spare someone a mistake." Food arrived: eggs, toast, pancakes. Halstead poured syrup with economy. Reeves took a slow bite, surprised by simple heat. "I put in a call," Halstead said, "not to make noise, to correct a record. Your recommendation wasn't rejected, only paused." Reeves looked past the window at a bus kneeling for an elderly man. "I don't need a higher medal." "No," Halstead said, "but the truth deserves its own paperwork." Reeves' new archives were battlefields too, and names could be lost. "If the record is corrected, include the team," he said. "Nothing I did was done alone." "It will," Halstead replied. Between sips, Reeves drifted to the rescue and its aftermath, the silence in the barracks. The way laughter came hollow for a week, the private bargains men made with the faces. In their heads, "Where will you keep the letter?" Halstead asked. "In the kitchen drawer with the spare batteries," Reeves said. "Somewhere I'll open by accident and remember on purpose." They paid at the register. The woman slid the paper cups across. "On the house," she said. Outside, a wind rattled the flag. They paused there, cups warming their hands. The sedan returned them to the reserve center. The crowd had thinned, leaving only the chaplain and the woman with the rose. She introduced herself as the mother from the letter. Reeves felt the ground tilt and right itself. She thanked him without repeating the letter's words, and he answered without repeating his own. They walked to the stone again. The new name had cured, its grit washed clean. Reeves touched the carving with 2 fingers, then stepped back. The chaplain offered a blessing. The mother rested her palm where his had been. "Will you come to the house?" she asked. "There's coffee. Nobody needs to talk." Reeves looked at Halstead. The general gave a nod that meant he would clear whatever stood in the way. Reeves agreed. The sedan followed her modest car through neighborhoods stitched by porches and hedges. Children in backpacks laughed at corners. The house was neat, a living room arranged by care rather than decorator. On the mantel stood a photograph of a young man in uniform. Another frame showed him in civilian clothes, a baseball cap crooked on his head. The mother set a plate of cookies on the coffee table and turned on a lamp though daylight filled the room. Reeves took a seat facing the window. They sat for a long time. She told him small things: the shade of blue her son liked, the way he whistled, The afternoon they burned a pie and ate it anyway. Reeves listened as if absorbing coordinates. Halstead said little, choosing the work of presence. When they rose, she pressed a folded note into Reeves's hand. A recipe, she said. He'd want you to have it. Back in the car, Reeves unfolded the paper. It wasn't a recipe. It was a sentence in careful print. Thank you for finding the part of him that could make it. Home? Traffic thickened. The driver merged into a stream of lives. Halstead cleared his throat. I'll go back to Washington tonight, he said. Keep the wheels turning. You already did, Reeves said. Then I'll keep them oiled, Halstead answered. They passed the airport again, the tower cutting a clean line into the sky. A jet climbed, banking toward the sun, and for a heartbeat Reeves saw the gate, the runway, the moment the general halted the day. Gratitude came not as fireworks, but as good engineering as a bridge that holds. The sedan slowed in front of Reeves's apartment. The sidewalk maple held a few stubborn leaves. He met Halstead. At the curb, if the record moves, the general said, I'll let you know. If it doesn't, Reeves said, we already did what mattered. They shook hands, a soldier's shake. Brief and exact, the sedan pulled away. Reeves stood in the crisp light, the city working around him. He climbed the stairs, unlocked his door, and walked to the kitchen. In the drawer with the batteries, he placed the mother's first letter and her second. He closed the drawer, then opened it again and smiled at himself for the check dotted the window. He watched the street. A delivery truck braked. A bicycle rang. A neighbor laughed on the phone. Reeves breathed, slow and deliberate. Some days asked for heroics. Most asked for steadiness. He could give that. He could give that again tomorrow. He made coffee, the simple kind, steam rising like a flag nobody needed to salute. On the counter lay his travel receipt, printed with the seat he hadn't used and the one he had. He folded it once and tucked. And near the letters, a small ledger of a course corrected. Then he sat, cup in hand, and let the day open, convinced by quiet evidence that, now and then, the world remembers what it owes, the journey that began in the cramped back row of a commercial. Jet ended far from the runway, but its meaning lingered in every step between. A general's decision to stop a departure wasn't about bending rules. It was about bending the arc of forgetfulness back toward memory. For Colonel Reeves, the day was not a celebration, but a rare acknowledgement that his sacrifices and the sacrifices of those who never made it home still mattered in a world moving too quickly to notice. We often measure progress by technology, convenience, and comfort. Yet moments like this remind us how easily the important can slip through the cracks if we let it. Recognition costs nothing but the will to give it, and its value lasts far longer than the gesture itself. The quiet dignity of that escort from the back of the plane to the front was more than symbolic. It was corrective, a small but powerful act of setting things right. In the end, this story is less about one man's seat and more about the seats we choose to give others in our collective memory, because when we forget the people who earn our respect, we lose far more than we realize.